Picture yourself stepping into a medieval marketplace. The thick smell of fresh blood, animal fat, and wood smoke hangs heavy in the still air. No mechanical refrigerators. No ice on demand. Only the rare noble ice house or the mercy of winter. Yet meat still had to remain safe enough to be sold, cooked, and eaten. What secrets allowed butchers of the Middle Ages to defeat decay? The invisible enemy lurking in every cut of flesh. In the medieval world, meat was never just food. It was both a luxury and a danger. While nobles and townspeople craved it for feasts and daily meals, everyone knew one simple truth. Fresh meat spoils quickly. Without modern preservation, a slab of beef left in the sun could turn foul in just a few hours. The smell of rot was more than unpleasant, it was deadly. Spoiled meat carried parasites, bacteria, and disease, threatening not just the individual but entire communities. Historical chronicles describe the horror of foodborne illness, especially in crowded cities where markets overflowed with hanging carcasses. People hesitated before making a purchase, sniffing the air, testing the texture, or trusting only the butcher they knew best. For the poor, the threat was even worse. They couldn't always afford the freshest cuts, often ending up with meat that was already questionable. Illnesses linked to spoiled meat haunted households, a grim reminder of their fragile hold on survival. To eat meat in the Middle Ages was to gamble, not with flavor but with life itself. The simplest solution to decay was speed. Butchers relied on the principle of daily slaughter. Animals were brought to market at dawn, and by mid-morning, their meat was already on display. Freshness was the only guarantee. Towns organized their markets so that livestock pens stood right next to butcher stalls, making the process seamless, from living animal to butchered meat within hours. This practice served two purposes. It kept food safe for customers, and it minimized the window in which rot could set in. Customers adapted their habits too. They didn't expect to store food for days. Instead, they bought only what could be eaten before nightfall. For many, the sound of bleating goats or squealing pigs in the morning signaled a day's worth of meals to come. This immediacy also carried symbolic weight. Fresh slaughter meant purity, vitality, and trust between butcher and buyer. In a world with severely limited cold storage, speed was survival. Medieval people developed a rhythm of life built around immediacy. Once a cut of meat left the butcher's stall, it was expected to be cooked within hours. Families purchased just enough for a meal or two, never more. Leftovers were rare, for extra food turned dangerous by the next sunrise. Recipes of the time reflect this urgency. Boiling, roasting, and frying were all fast methods meant to transform raw meat into safe nourishment. Markets themselves were designed for quick turnover, with sellers loudly calling to customers, pushing their stock before the day's heat spoiled it. For peasants and townspeople alike, the principle was clear: consume before rot begins. Wealthier households staffed with cooks sometimes attempted longer storage by hanging meat in cool cellars. But even these attempts were short-term. Eating quickly wasn't merely a preference, it was survival logic. Every meal was a race against decay. Salt was the ultimate weapon against corruption. In some parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where the trans-Saharan trade flourished, it was worth more than gold by weight. Even in Europe, it was taxed and traded like a precious commodity. The French gabelli, Venetian monopolies, and English salt taxes all testify to its extraordinary value. When rubbed into raw meat or soaked as brine, salt drew out moisture, the very thing bacteria need to thrive. Salted meat became leathery, sometimes extremely tough, but it could last for weeks or even months. Soldiers, sailors, and pilgrims depended on salted pork or beef packed tightly in barrels that traveled across kingdoms. For everyday households, a small store of salted meat meant security during harsh winters or fasting seasons when fresh slaughter was limited. The taste was strong, often requiring soaking in water before cooking, but its preservation was unmatched. Beyond practicality, salted meat carried symbolic weight. It was the taste of endurance, of preparation for scarcity, of triumph against time itself. Without salt, medieval life would have been far more fragile. To medieval people, smoke was more than the smell of fire. It was preservation itself. By hanging cuts of meat above burning wood, butchers transformed fresh flesh into something that could survive for months. The smoke infused the surface with antimicrobial compounds and slowly dried the meat, shrinking it into denser, tougher forms. This process gave birth to smoked hams, sausages, and fish that became staples across Europe. Villages often maintained smokehouses, Simple huts where families brought their portions to hang from rafters, letting the smoke do its work. The choice of wood mattered. Oak and beech were common, each lending distinct flavors. In larger towns, smokehouses stood near bakeries, churches, or castles, producing vast stores for armies, monasteries, or winter reserves. The method wasn't perfect. Smoked meat was chewy, salty, and required careful cooking to soften again. Yet it carried an aura of strength. To taste smoked meat was to taste survival, the magic of fire turning fragility into endurance. For medieval society, smoke was a refrigerator made of air and ash. Where salt and smoke failed, ingenuity stepped in. Vinegar, wine, and spices became guardians of freshness and symbols of wealth and sophistication. Cuts of meat were sometimes soaked in acidic liquids, which slowed bacterial growth while tenderizing texture. Wine added both acidity and prestige, turning a preservation trick into a noble dish. But perhaps the most fascinating element was the use of spices imported along the Silk Road. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves cost fortunes, often worth many times the price of the meat itself by weight. These weren't primarily meant to hide rotten meat, as old myths suggest. After all, the poor who might have questionable meat couldn't afford spices at 10 times the cost of the food they were trying to salvage. Instead, spices served multiple purposes. They were powerful status symbols, they were believed to balance bodily humors according to medieval medicine, and they were genuinely prized for their bold, complex flavors. That said, spices could help overpower any faint off notes in meat that was still considered edible, allowing skilled cooks to stretch ingredients further and create dishes that delighted the palate despite less than perfect starting materials. For common folk, herbs like garlic, thyme, and rosemary played a humbler role, offering modest protection and a semblance of freshness. Together, vinegar, wine, and spices illustrate the creativity of medieval kitchens, not only to preserve, but to transform ordinary ingredients into something remarkable and sometimes even medicinal. In the cold climates of Northern and Eastern Europe, nature itself provided the most effective preservation method: ice and snow. During the long winters, meat could be kept in underground cellars or outdoor pits, where freezing temperatures slowed decay almost entirely. Wealthy estates and monasteries even harvested blocks of ice from frozen rivers and lakes, storing them in insulated ice houses packed with straw and earth. These primitive freezers could last well into spring, offering fresh meat far beyond the slaughtering season. This was true cold storage, limited to the elite, labor-intensive, and dependent on climate, but remarkably effective when available. Ordinary villages relied on the brutal severity of winter. Carcasses hung outside in the cold became as hard as stone, practically frozen until thawed for use. For communities living in the shadow of the Baltic or the Alps, the climate itself acted as their ally, a natural guardian against rot. Yet reliance on ice had its limits. Warm seasons always returned, forcing people back to salting, smoking, and spicing. Still, the memory of frozen abundance shaped their rhythm of survival. Winter was not only a season of scarcity, it was paradoxically the safest time to eat meat. Meat was too essential and too dangerous to leave entirely to chance. Medieval towns enforced strict regulations over butchers and markets. City councils posted ordinances against selling spoiled meat or mixing old meat with fresh cuts. Inspectors, often guild members or officials called meat viewers, patrolled stalls checking quality. Punishments for deception ranged from fines to public humiliation, being forced to display rotten meat or fish in the town square as a warning. In extreme cases, butchers caught repeatedly selling tainted goods could lose their licenses, their livelihoods destroyed. Guilds also played a crucial role, policing their own members to maintain collective reputation. These laws reflected deep anxiety. One bad cut could sicken dozens, even spark outbreaks in crowded towns. For rulers, protecting meat supply was both a matter of public health and political stability. Chroniclers tell of riots when people suspected corruption in the market, proof of how fragile trust could be. In this way, law became another preservative, less tangible than salt or smoke, but just as essential in protecting communities against the hidden threat of rot. Despite all precautions, preservation often failed. For the poor especially, spoiled meat was an unavoidable reality. Unable to afford freshly slaughtered cuts or expensive spices, they sometimes bought what wealthier customers refused, meat already turning gravy or giving off a sour odor. Chroniclers described stomach illnesses sweeping through villages after communal feasts when bad meat was cooked and served because no one dared waste it. Some recipes even evolved as strategies of making the most of less-than-ideal ingredients. Heavy stews and acidic sauces that could render borderline meat palatable. But this was always a gamble. Food poisoning, diarrhea, and fevers followed, sometimes leading to death in vulnerable populations. For rulers and clergy, such dangers justified strict oversight of butchers. But the reality remained. Hunger often won over caution. The suffering of the lower classes meant that the line between nourishment and risk blurred daily. To eat questionable meat was not just misfortune. It was a symbol of poverty's cruelty, where survival itself demanded accepting greater danger. The medieval struggle against rot shaped the foundations of modern food culture. Every method, salting, smoking, cellaring, spicing, even legislating, was a stepping stone toward what refrigeration accomplishes easily today. Walk into a modern supermarket and you see the triumph of technology. Glass cases humming with cold, shelves of vacuum-sealed meat, expiration dates carefully printed. Yet behind this abundance lies a hidden continuity. The fear of decay still guides us, even if the tools are different. Food safety laws echo medieval ordinances. Preserved meats, smoked hams, salted cod, spiced sausages, remain staples, not just relics of necessity, but symbols of tradition. What medieval people fought against daily we barely consider. And yet their wisdom survives in our kitchens. To bite into bacon, to season with salt and pepper, to cook with vinegar or wine, is to taste the echoes of their struggle. Their battle with decay was more than survival. It was a creative war that shaped culture, cuisine, and community. The story of medieval butchers reminds us, every meal we enjoy today is a quiet victory over time, rot, and death itself.